On the evening of January 30th, 1933, a river of fire flowed through the heart of Berlin. Thousands of men carrying torches marched through the Brandenburg Gate, their flames casting dancing shadows on the great columns. The men wore the brown shirts of the SA, the black uniforms of the SS, the steel helmets of the Stahlhelm. They marched in disciplined columns, their boots striking the pavement in unison, singing the Horst Wessel song and other Nazi anthems. Onlookers lined the streets, some cheering, some watching in silence, some slipping away into the darkness, already afraid. The marchers turned down the Wilhelmstrasse, passing the government ministries that lined the avenue, and halted before the Reich Chancellery. There, in a window on the first floor, stood a figure illuminated by the torchlight below. He raised his arm in the Nazi salute, again and again, acknowledging the adulation of his followers. Adolf Hitler had become the Chancellor of Germany. The appointment had come that morning in a brief ceremony in President Hindenburg's office. Hitler had taken the oath of office, promising to uphold the Constitution he intended to destroy. Fulg, 85 years old and failing, had reportedly referred to Hitler as that Bohemian corporal, a double error since Hitler was Austrian, not Bohemian, and had been a lance corporal, not a corporal. The old field marshal despised the vulgar agitator he had been forced to accept. But he had accepted him nonetheless. A few blocks away at the Hotel Kaiserhof, where the Nazi leadership had awaited the news, there had been scenes of wild celebration. Hitler's followers embraced, wept. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda chief, had spent the day orchestrating the Torchlight parade that would announce the Nazi triumph to the world. Not everyone was celebrating. In working-class neighborhoods, social democrats and communists gathered in their meeting halls, discussing what to do. Some advocated a general strike, a mass uprising to prevent the Nazis from consolidating power. Others counseled patience. Hitler was merely chancellor, not dictator. He led a coalition cabinet in which Nazis held only 3 positions. The Constitution still stood. Elections would be held. Surely the German people would see through Hitler and reject him at the polls. In the offices of the conservative politicians who had engineered Hitler's appointment, the mood was self-congratulatory. Franz von Papen, the former chancellor who had persuaded Hindenburg to appoint Hitler, was particularly pleased with himself. "We've hired him," Papen boasted to a colleague. "Within 2 months, we will have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he'll squeak." It was perhaps the greatest miscalculation in political history. Within 2 months, Hitler would be the dictator of Germany. Within 18 months, Papen would be lucky to escape with his life. Within 6 years, the world would be at war. And within 12 years, Germany would be a smoking ruin. Hitler would be dead, and the Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years would be finished. But on the night of January 30th, 1933, as the torches blazed and the columns marched and the crowds roared, none of that was visible. What was visible was power, raw, exultant, triumphant. The man who had failed as an artist, who had lived in a homeless shelter, who had spent years as a fringe agitator, who had been imprisoned for treason, now held the highest office in Germany. This is the story of how that happened. Of how a democracy committed suicide. Of how a civilized nation surrendered its freedom to a man who promised to destroy everything it had built. Of how the safeguards that were supposed to prevent tyranny failed, one by one, until nothing remained but the will of the Führer. This is the story of the coming of the Third Reich. The catastrophe began on the other side of the Atlantic, in the financial district of New York City. On October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday, panic swept the New York Stock Exchange. Stock prices, which had been rising for years in a speculative bubble, suddenly collapsed. Investors who had bought stocks on margin were wiped out. Banks that had lent money for stock purchases faced catastrophic losses. The panic spread from Wall Street to Main Street, from finance to industry, from America to the world. The Great Depression that followed was the worst economic crisis in modern history. In the United States, industrial production fell by nearly half. Unemployment rose from 3% to 25%. Banks failed by the thousands. Farmers lost their land. Families lost their homes. The prosperity of the 1920s vanished almost overnight. For Germany, the consequences were even more severe. The German economy of the late 1920s had been built on American loans. German banks borrowed from American banks, German companies borrowed from German banks, and the whole structure depended on the continued flow of American credit. When the crash came, American creditors called in their loans. The flow of credit reversed. German banks failed. German companies closed. German workers lost their jobs. By 1932, German unemployment had reached 6 million, nearly a third of the workforce. The actual number of people affected was far higher, since each unemployed worker had family members who depended on their income. Perhaps half of the German population was directly touched by unemployment. The human suffering was immense. Men who had worked all their lives found themselves standing in breadlines, humiliated and hopeless. Families were evicted from their apartments when they could not pay rent. Young people who had never had a job saw no prospect of ever getting one. Hunger returned to German cities that had not known it since the war years. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Germans who had lived through the hyperinflation of 1923 and rebuilt their lives now found themselves ruined again. The middle class, which had finally begun to recover, was destroyed a second time. Faith in the system, in democracy and capitalism, in the establishment parties, collapsed. People were desperate for change, for someone who would do something, anything, to end the crisis. The Weimar Republic's political system was paralyzed. The coalition governments that had provided stability in the late 1920s fell apart as parties disagreed about how to respond to the crisis. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, a Center Party politician who took office in March 1930, tried to address the Depression through austerity, cutting government spending, reducing wages, and balancing the budget. His policies were economically orthodox, but politically disastrous. They deepened the Depression and discredited the democratic government. When Brüning could not get his austerity measures through the Reichstag, he resorted to Article 48 of the Constitution, the emergency provision that allowed the president to rule by decree. Hindenburg signed the decrees, and Germany began to be governed without parliamentary approval. Democracy was already dying before Hitler took power. The Reichstag election of September 1930 revealed the political earthquake that the Depression had caused. The Nazi Party, which had won only 2.6% of the vote in 12 seats in 1928, won 18.3% and 107 seats. Overnight, the Nazis had gone from a fringe movement to the second largest party in Germany. The Nazi breakthrough stunned observers. Foreign correspondents who had dismissed Hitler as a beer hall agitator suddenly realized that he commanded a mass movement. German conservatives who had hoped to use the Nazis as shock troops against the left now had to reckon with a force that might escape their control. And German Democrats, watching the results come in, understood that the Republic was in mortal danger. The Nazi surge reflected years of patient organization building. After his release from prison in 1924, Hitler had resolved to achieve power through legal means rather than violent revolution. The beer hall putsch had taught him that the state could not be overthrown by a few thousand armed men. Power had to be won through elections, through building a mass movement that could compete for votes and eventually dominate the political system. Hitler rebuilt the Nazi Party as a disciplined, hierarchical organization with himself as absolute leader. The Führerprinzip, the leadership principle, meant that all authority flowed from Hitler, and all subordinates owed him unconditional obedience. The party was organized geographically, with Gauleiter regional leaders controlling each district, and functionally with separate organizations for women, youth, students, workers, and other groups. The Sturmabteilung, or stormtroopers, grew from a few thousand in 1925 to over 400,000 by 1932. These brown-shirted paramilitaries provided the muscle for the Nazi movement. They protected Nazi meetings, disrupted opponents' meetings, brawled with communists in the streets, and created an atmosphere of violence and intimidation that benefited the party. Many same men were unemployed workers and veterans who found in the organization a sense of purpose, camaraderie, and 3 meals a day. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, originally Hitler's personal bodyguard, remained smaller but more Under Heinrich Himmler, who took command in 1929, the SS cultivated an image of racial purity and fanatical loyalty. Its members were selected according to racial criteria and held to strict standards of discipline. The SS would eventually become the instrument of Nazi terror, but in the early 1930s it was still subordinate to the SA. Nazi propaganda was extraordinarily effective. Joseph Goebbels, who became the party's propaganda chief in 1930, understood modern mass communication as few politicians did. He organized spectacular rallies that created a sense of overwhelming power and national unity. He used films, radio, and the new technology of loudspeakers to reach audiences that previous political movements could not have imagined. He crafted simple, emotional messages that appealed to people's fears and hopes. The message was always the same. Germany had been betrayed. The November criminals had stabbed the army in the back. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated the nation. The Jews were responsible for Germany's problems, for the defeat in the war, for the inflation, for the depression, for Bolshevism and capitalism alike. Only Hitler could save Germany. Only the Nazi movement could restore national greatness. But to millions of desperate Germans, it was also a message of hope. Hitler promised action, strength, and unity. He promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, to end unemployment, to crush the communists, and to make Germany great again. He offered simple answers to complex problems, enemies to blame for national suffering, and a vision of a glorious future. The party's electoral strategy targeted specific groups with tailored appeals. Farmers heard promises of debt relief and protection from foreign competition. Workers heard promises of jobs and national solidarity. The middle class heard promises of order and security. Veterans heard promises of military revival and national redemption. Women heard promises of strong families and moral renewal. Everyone heard that the Jews were the enemy. The political crisis deepened through 1931 and 1932 as Germany became ungovernable. Brüning's austerity policies failed to end the Depression and succeeded only in making him unpopular. Hindenburg, increasingly senile and increasingly influenced by conservative advisors who despised the Republic, dismissed Brüning in May 1932 and appointed Franz von Papen as Chancellor. Papen was an aristocrat, a former military officer, a Catholic conservative with no political base of his own. He governed through presidential decrees, without majority support in the Reich. He lifted the ban on the Sabbath that Brüning had imposed, unleashing a wave of political violence that left hundreds dead in street battles between Nazis and communists. The Reichstag election of July 1932 made the Nazis the largest party in Germany, with 37.4% of the vote and 230 seats. Hitler demanded the chancellorship. Hindenburg refused, reportedly telling Hitler that he could not entrust the government to a party that was so intolerant toward those who thought differently. Instead, Hindenburg kept Papen in office. Papen's government was paralyzed. It had no majority in the Reichstag and could govern only through presidential decree. When the Reichstag met, the communists and Nazis, who together held a majority, voted no confidence. Papen dissolved the Reichstag and called new elections. The November 1932 election saw the Nazi vote decline for the first time, falling to 33.1%. The party seemed to have reached its ceiling. It had not won a majority and was unlikely to do so. Its finances were strained by the constant campaigning. Some leaders worried that the movement had peaked. Papen, meanwhile, had been replaced by General Kurt von Schleicher, who tried to split the Nazi party by offering the vice-chancellorship to Gregor Strasser, a senior Nazi who represented the party's more socialist wing. The intrigue failed. Strasser resigned from the party rather than break with Hitler, but it demonstrated the possibility of dividing the Nazis if they were kept out of power long enough. Hitler's moment seemed to be passing. If the Democratic parties had united, if the conservatives had not been so determined to destroy the Republic, if the communists had cooperated with the Social Democrats, the Nazi threat might have been contained. But none of these things happened. Instead, Papen approached Hitler with a new proposal. Papen would persuade Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor, with Papen as vice-chancellor, and with conservatives holding most cabinet positions. The Nazis would have only 3 ministries out of. Hitler would be boxed in by conservatives who would prevent him from doing anything radical. Hitler accepted. Hindenburg, who had sworn never to appoint that Bohemian corporal, was persuaded that the arrangement was safe. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The conservatives who had arranged Hitler's appointment believed they were in control. They were catastrophically wrong. Hitler understood that he needed to move quickly before his opponents could organize resistance. His immediate goal was new Reichstag elections that would give the Nazis a majority, or at least enough seats to pass an enabling act that would allow him to rule by decree. The cabinet agreed to new elections, scheduled for March 5th, 1933. The campaign that followed was unlike any Germany had seen. The Nazis now controlled the resources of the state, the police, the radio, the government apparatus. Nazi rallies were broadcast nationwide. Nazi speakers dominated the airwaves. Some men attacked opposition meetings, beat up opponents, and terrorized anyone who dared to resist. Then, on the night of February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building caught fire. The fire started in the plenary chamber and spread rapidly through the old building. By the time firefighters arrived, the chamber was an inferno. The great glass dome collapsed. The building that symbolized German democracy was reduced to a burned-out shell. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested at the scene. He confessed to setting the fire, claiming he had acted alone as a protest against the capitalist system. The Nazis, however, immediately proclaimed that the fire was the signal for a communist uprising. Hitler declared, "This is a God-given signal. If this fire, as I believe, is the work of the communists, then we must crush out this murderous pest with an iron fist." The question of who really started the Reichstag fire has been debated ever since. Van der Lubbe was certainly present and certainly set fires. But the speed with which the blaze spread and the suspiciously convenient timing for the Nazis have led many historians to conclude that the Nazis helped, that they used van der Lubbe as a dupe while their own agents ensured the building would be destroyed. Whatever the truth, the Nazis exploited the fire ruthlessly. The very next day, February 28th, Hindenburg signed the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended the constitutional protections for civil liberties. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, privacy of communications, protection against arbitrary arrest, all were suspended indefinitely. The decree authorized the Reich government to take over state governments that failed to maintain order. The Reichstag fire decree was the legal foundation of the Nazi dictatorship. It remained in effect until 1945 and provided the basis for the arrest of political opponents, the suppression of opposition parties, the establishment of concentration camps, and all the other instruments of terror. Everything that followed, the persecution of Jews, the destruction of democracy, the war of conquest, rested on this single decree signed by Hindenburg the morning after the fire. In the week between the fire and the election, the Say and police arrested thousands of communists and social democrats. The Communist Party was effectively banned, its leaders imprisoned or in flight. The remaining opposition parties were harassed and intimidated. The elections of March 5, 1933, were not free by any reasonable definition. Yet, even under these conditions, the Nazis won only 43.9% of the vote. With their coalition partners, the German National People's Party (DNVP), they had a bare majority of 51.8%. It was enough to govern, but not enough to change the Constitution, which required a two-thirds majority. The Enabling Act was Hitler's solution to this problem. Officially called the Law to Remedy the Distress of the People in the Reich, the Enabling Act would give the cabinet, which meant Hitler, the power to enact laws without the Reichstag's approval, even laws that deviated from the Constitution. It would, in effect, make Hitler the dictator. Passing the Enabling Act required a two-thirds majority, which meant the Nazis needed votes from beyond their coalition. They got them through a combination of promises, threats, and procedural manipulation. The Center Party, the Catholic Party that had been part of the Weimar coalition, was the crucial swing vote. Its leaders extracted promises from Hitler that he would respect the rights of the Catholic Church and would not use the Enabling Act against the Center Party itself. These promises were worthless. Hitler had no intention of keeping them, but the Center Party chose to believe them. The communists were excluded from the vote entirely, their deputies arrested or in hiding. The Social Democrats, the only party that would vote against the Enabling Act, were intimidated but present. Cement lined the walls of the Kroll Opera House, the temporary meeting place since the Reichstag had burned, glaring at the deputies as they voted. Otto Wels, the leader of the Social Democrats, rose to speak against the Enabling Act in one of the bravest moments in German parliamentary history. Freedom and life can be taken from us, he declared, but not our honor. After the persecution that the Social Democratic Party has suffered recently, no one can fairly demand or expect that it vote for the Enabling Act. Hitler replied with a speech of venomous contempt. The star of Germany will rise and yours will sink. Your death knell has sounded. Though it was 444 in favor, 94 against, only the Social Democrats voted no. The Enabling Act was passed. Democracy in Germany was dead. The destruction of German institutions followed with terrifying speed. Within weeks, the state governments were taken over by Nazi commissioners. Within months, all political parties except the Nazis were banned or dissolved. The trade unions were abolished, their assets seized, their leaders arrested. The press was brought under Nazi control. The civil service was purged of Jews and political opponents. The universities were coordinated, Gleichgestellt, with Jewish and liberal professors driven from their positions. The persecution of Jews began immediately. On April 1, 1933, the Nazis organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. Some men stood outside Jewish-owned shops, warning Germans not to buy from Jews. Signs appeared: Germans, defend yourselves, don't buy from Jews. The boycott was only partially successful. Many Germans ignored it, but it signaled that the Jews had no protection from the new regime. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service, passed on April 7, 1933, required the dismissal of non-Aryan civil servants. This affected thousands of Jewish doctors, lawyers, teachers, and government officials who lost their jobs and their livelihoods. Similar laws soon applied to other professions. On May 10, 1933, Nazi students organized book burnings at universities across Germany. Works by Jewish authors, by critics of Nazism, by anyone deemed un-German, were thrown into bonfires while crowds cheered and bands played. In Berlin, Goebbels addressed the crowd. The era of extreme Jewish intellectualism is now at an end. The future German man will not just be a man of books, but a man of character. Among the authors whose works were burned were Heinrich Heine, Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, Thomas Mann, Ernest Hemingway, H.G. Wells, Jack London, and Helen Keller. Heine, the 19th century German Jewish poet, had written prophetically a century earlier, "Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people also." The concentration camps began operating almost immediately after the seizure of power. The first to Dachau opened in March 1933, just weeks after Hitler became Chancellor. It was designed to hold political prisoners, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, anyone who opposed the regime. The camps were not yet death camps. That would come later, but they were places of brutal imprisonment, torture, and murder. Theodor Eich, the SS officer who organized Dachau, established the model that would later be applied across the camp system. Prisoners were stripped of their identity, given numbers instead of names, subjected to arbitrary violence, worked to exhaustion, and kept in constant fear. Those who resisted were beaten or killed. Those who survived learned that resistance was futile. By the end of 1933, Germany had been transformed. The Weimar Republic, with all its flaws and all its promise, was gone. In its place stood a one-party dictatorship that controlled every aspect of German life. The speed of the transformation astonished observers at home and abroad. How had a civilized nation with a rich cultural heritage and strong democratic traditions surrendered its freedom so quickly? The answer lay in a combination of factors that came together with devastating effect. The Depression had discredited the democratic parties and made millions of Germans desperate for change. The Weimar Constitution's emergency provisions gave the president powers that could be used to undermine democracy. The conservative elites who controlled the army, the bureaucracy, and the economy chose to ally with Hitler rather than defend the republic. The communists and social democrats, who together might have stopped the Nazis, were divided by decades of mutual hostility and could not cooperate. And Hitler himself was a political genius who understood how to exploit every weakness and seize every opportunity. But the transformation was not complete. One obstacle remained: the SODA. The SA has grown to over 4 million men by 1934, far larger than the German army, which was limited to 100,000 by the Treaty of Versailles. Its leader, Ernst Röhm, was one of Hitler's oldest comrades, a veteran of the beer hall putsch, a man who believed that the Nazi revolution had only begun. Röhm wanted the SA to absorb the army and become the military force of the new Reich, with himself as its commander. The army leadership was horrified. The officer corps, drawn from the aristocracy and the professional military class, despised the SA as a rabble of street fighters and criminals. They had tolerated Hitler because they believed he would restore German military strength and overthrow Versailles. But they would not tolerate being absorbed into the SA. Hitler faced a choice. He needed the army to achieve his goals of rearmament and conquest. But Röhm was a loyal comrade who commanded millions of men. If Hitler moved against Röhm, he risked civil war within the Nazi movement. If he did not, he risked alienating the army at the moment when he needed it most. The conservatives around Hindenburg increased the pressure. Vice Chancellor Peipen gave a speech at Marburg on June 17, 1934, criticizing the excesses of the Nazi regime and calling for moderation. The speech was widely interpreted as a warning from the conservative establishment and from Hindenburg, whose health was failing. Hitler must bring the SA under control or face the consequences. Hitler made his choice. The Night of the Long Knives began on June 30, 1934, and continued through the following days. Hitler flew to Munich and personally led the arrest of Röhm, who was seized at a Bavarian resort where he was staying with other SA leaders. Across Germany, SS squads arrested SA commanders who were taken to prisons and shot. The killing was systematic and merciless, but the purge went far beyond this SA. Hitler used the opportunity to settle old scores and eliminate potential threats. Gregor Strasser, the Nazi leader who had nearly split the party in 1932, was murdered. Kurt von Schleicher, the former chancellor who had tried to block Hitler's appointment, was shot at his home, along with his wife. Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the Bavarian official who had betrayed the beer hall putsch in 1923, was hacked to death with pickaxes. Catholic leaders, conservative politicians, and anyone else on the SS death lists were killed. At least 85 people were murdered during the purge. The actual number may have been several hundred. Ernst Röhm, held in a prison cell, was offered a pistol to shoot himself. When he refused, SS men entered the cell and shot him. "If I am to be killed, let Adolf do it himself," Röhm reportedly said before he died. Hitler justified the killings in a Reichstag speech on July 13th. He claimed that Röhm had been planning a coup, that the SA had been corrupt and treasonous, and that he had been forced to act to save Germany from civil war. In this hour, Hitler declared, "I was responsible for the fate of the German people, and thereby I became the supreme judge of the German people. Everyone must know for all future time that if he raises his hand to strike the state, then certain death is his lot." The Reichstag applauded. The cabinet passed a law retroactively legalizing the murders as emergency defense measures of the state. Hindenburg sent Hitler a telegram congratulating him on nipping treason in the bud. The army, which had provided weapons and transport for the SS killing squads, issued a statement praising Hitler's soldierly decision and exemplary courage. The Night of the Long Knives demonstrated that there was no law in Nazi Germany except Hitler's will. The regime would kill anyone it chose, including its own members, without trial, without evidence, without even the pretense of legality. The message was received. After June 30th, 1934, no one in Germany could doubt what the Nazis were capable of. The final step in Hitler's consolidation of power came on August 2nd, 1934, when Paul von Hindenburg died. The old field marshal was 86 years old and had been failing for months. His death removed the last constitutional check on Hitler's power, the presidency, which controlled the army and could theoretically have dismissed the Chancellor. Hitler moved immediately to eliminate this check permanently. Within hours of Hindenburg's death, the cabinet announced that the offices of the President and Chancellor would be merged. Hitler would henceforth be Führer and Reich Chancellor, combining all executive authority in his person. The army, which had sworn loyalty to Hindenburg as President and Supreme Commander, would now swear loyalty to Hitler personally. On August 19, 1934, a plebiscite was held to ratify this arrangement. The German people were asked whether they approved of Hitler's assumption of the presidency. Under conditions of intimidation and propaganda saturation, 89.9% voted yes. The Nazis proclaimed that the German people had endorsed Hitler's dictatorship. The oath that German soldiers now swore was unprecedented. Previous oaths had been to the Constitution, or to the nation, or to the office of the Supreme Commander. The new oath was to Adolf Hitler personally. I swear by God this sacred oath that to the leader of the German Empire and people, Adolf Hitler, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, I shall render unconditional obedience, and that as a brave soldier I shall at all times be prepared to give my life for this oath. This personal oath would have profound consequences. German officers who later opposed Hitler would struggle with the conflict between their conscience and their sworn word. Many who might have resisted chose not to because they had given their oath. The oath bound the army to Hitler with chains of honor that proved almost impossible to break. By August 1934, the transformation was complete. Hitler was Führer, the undisputed, absolute ruler of Germany. There were no competing centers of power, no constitutional limitations, no institutional checks. The army was loyal. The party was obedient. The people were cowed. The Third Reich had arrived. How had it happened? How had a nation of 65 million people, with a rich cultural heritage, with universities and churches and courts of law, surrendered its freedom to a movement that openly proclaimed its intention to establish a dictatorship? Part of the answer was force. The Nazis used violence systematically and ruthlessly. They beat their opponents, imprisoned them, and killed them. Once in power, they controlled the police, the prisons, and the concentration camps. Resistance meant risking everything: your job, your freedom, your life, the safety of your family. Part of the answer was propaganda. The Nazis controlled the press, the radio, and the public discourse. They repeated their lies so often and so loudly that many people came to believe them. They created an atmosphere in which dissent seemed not just dangerous, but unpatriotic, in which conformity was the path of least resistance. Part of the answer was complicity. The conservative elites, the army, the bureaucracy, the industrialists, the churches chose to cooperate with Hitler rather than resist him. They believed they could use him for their own purposes. They believed he was a temporary expedient who would restore order and then be controlled. By the time they realized their error, it was too late. Part of the answer was division. The parties and groups that might have resisted the Nazis were unable to unite. The Social Democrats and Communists hated each other as much as they hated the Nazis. The Catholics were divided between those who saw Hitler as a threat and those who saw him as a bulwark against Bolshevism. The liberals were too few and too weak to matter. Part of the answer was despair. The Depression had destroyed millions of lives and shattered faith in the people who had lost everything were willing to gamble on Hitler because they had nothing left to lose. The promise of national renewal, of jobs, of restored dignity was irresistible to those who had been beaten down by years of economic catastrophe. And part of the answer was Hitler himself. He was a genius of a particular and terrible kind, a genius of manipulation, of propaganda, of understanding what people wanted to hear and telling it to them. He could inspire fanatical loyalty in his followers and paralyzing fear in his opponents. He understood power as few politicians ever have, and he was willing to do anything to achieve it. The Germany of August 1934 was unrecognizable from the Germany of January 1933. In just 19 months, Hitler had destroyed democracy, eliminated his opponents purged his own movement, and made himself an absolute ruler. The speed was breathtaking. But the transformation was not just political. It was also moral. The German people had accepted, or at least acquiesced in, the destruction of the rule of law. They had watched as their Jewish neighbors were persecuted and done nothing. They had accepted murder as a legitimate tool of government. They had sworn loyalty to a man rather than to principles or institutions. Not everyone accepted. Some Germans resisted from the beginning and never stopped. Some went into exile, continuing the fight from abroad. Some maintained inner opposition, refusing to surrender their conscience even if they could not act openly. These people deserved to be remembered and honored, but they were a minority. The majority went along. Some were enthusiastic Nazis, some were passive conformists, some were afraid. But the result was the same. Hitler ruled and Germany followed. The Third Reich that Hitler created would last 12 years, not the 1,000 years he promised. In those 12 years, it would start a war that killed 60 million people. It would murder 6 million Jews and millions of others in an industrial genocide without parallel in history. It would devastate Europe, destroy Germany, and reshape the world. All of that lay in the future as Hitler stood at the pinnacle of power in August 1934. He had achieved what he set out to achieve in 1919, when he joined a tiny extremist party in Munich. He controlled Germany. Now he could begin to implement the program he had outlined in Mein Kampf, the rearmament, the conquest of living space, the racial war against the Jews. The coming of the Third Reich was complete. The road to the Second World War was open. The experience of ordinary Germans during these months of transformation varied enormously. For convinced Nazis, it was a time of triumph and vindication. Years of struggle, of street fighting, of ridicule and persecution had ended in victory. The movement had conquered the state. The Führer was in power. Everything seemed possible. One young Nazi later recalled, "We were drunk with victory. We had fought for years, had been beaten and imprisoned, and had lost friends in the street battles. Now we had won. Germany would be renewed. The shame of Versailles would be erased. We would be great again. We believed it with all our hearts." For opponents of the regime, it was a time of terror. Social Democrats, communists, trade unionists, anyone who had opposed the Nazis, faced arrest, imprisonment, or worse. Many fled the country if they could. Those who remained lived in fear, knowing that a careless word or a denunciation by a neighbor could mean a visit from the Gestapo. One Social Democrat recalled, "We went from meeting to meeting, trying to decide what to do. Some wanted to fight, to call a general strike. But it was too late. The Nazis controlled the police, the radio, everything. Friends disappeared, arrested in the night, taken to camps. We learned to be silent, to trust no one to survive. For Jews, the transformation was existential." They were suddenly outcasts in the country where many families had lived for generations. Their businesses were boycotted, their jobs were taken, their children were tormented at school. Some still hoped it was temporary, that Germany would come to its senses. Others understood immediately what was happening and fled if they could. One Jewish doctor, dismissed from his hospital in 1933, later wrote, "We had been Germans. My father fought in the war. My grandfather fought in 1870. We believed in Germany and Goethe and Beethoven and everything German culture represented. Suddenly we were told we were not Germans, had never been Germans, could never be Germans, could never be Germans. We were the enemy within." For many ordinary Germans who were neither committed Nazis nor targeted victims, the transformation was experienced as a mixture of relief and unease. The violence on the streets had ended. The political chaos had ended. There were jobs again, or at least the promise of jobs. The trains ran on time. Germany was respected again. But there were also the arrests, the disappearances, the speeches full of hatred. There was the pressure to conform, to join Nazi organizations, to give the Hitler salute, to denounce anyone who didn't. There was the sense that something had changed fundamentally, that the old rules no longer applied. One German civil servant who kept a private diary wrote in 1934, "I do not like what is happening. The brutality, the vulgarity, the persecution of the Jews, there's not the Germany I grew up in. But what can I do? I have a family to support. If I protest, I will lose my position, perhaps my freedom. So I stay silent, do my work, and try not to see too much. This was the experience of millions. They were not heroes, but neither were they monsters. They were ordinary people who found themselves in a situation they had not chosen and could not control. They made their accommodations with the regime, told themselves it was necessary, and tried to live normal lives in abnormal times. In doing so, they made the dictatorship possible. The Third Reich was not built by Hitler alone or even by the Nazi Party alone. It was built by the millions of Germans who went along, who voted, who joined, who obeyed, who turned away from what they did not want to see. Dictatorship requires accomplices, and in 1933-1934, Germany provided them. We close this episode. Standing in August 1934, we can see both what has been accomplished and what is yet to come. Hitler has achieved total power. He has destroyed the opposition, purged his own movement, and made himself dictator. Germany is his to command. But the program outlined in Mein Kampf has barely begun. The rearmament of Germany, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the conquest of living space in the East, all of this lies in the future. The international community watches with growing unease. Some hope that power will moderate Hitler, that the responsibilities of government will temper his radicalism. Others see clearly what is coming and try to warn their governments, usually in vain. The German people, most of them, have not yet realized what they have surrendered. They have exchanged freedom for order, democracy for dictatorship, the rule of law for the rule of one man. They will discover in time that the bargain was a catastrophe. The Third Reich will last 12 years, from January 1933 to May 1945. In those 12 years, it will produce suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. It will murder millions, destroy nations, and bring Europe to ruin. And it will end where it began, in violence and chaos and the ashes of a destroyed civilization. But in August 1934, the horror is still mostly in the future. What is visible now is power, consolidated and challenged, absolute. Hitler stands at the pinnacle, master of Germany, ready to reshape the world according to his vision. The Third Reich has come, and the world has not yet understood what that means. Next time, we will examine the Nazi state in action, how it organized, how it controlled, how it prepared for war. We will see Hitler's consolidation of power, the Nuremberg laws, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, and the first steps toward the war of conquest. We will witness the regime in its prime before the catastrophe it created consumed it. The coming of the Third Reich is complete. Now the Third Reich itself would show the world what it intended to do.